1968 Olympics, the forgotten story of the Black Power salute. What was it? At the 1968 Olympics, Tommie Smith and John Carlos, two African-American men, held their fists up in a black right salute. They had come first and third in the 200-meter sprint. This was an act of bravery due to the racial unfairness of the time. Often lost in their act of bravery is the man that came second, Peter Norman. Norman was a white Australian runner who decided to stand by Smith and Carlos and wore a badge advertising the Black Power symbol, the fist, with them on the podium. Why was this so brave? People were angry with Smith and Carlos for doing this, as at the time, black people had different rights compared to white people, and people thought that it was a fair society even though it was not. So Smith and Carlos were lawbreakers in some people's eyes. When Smith and Carlos spoke to Norman about what they were going to do, he said 4 words they would never forget: "I'll stand with you." Nowadays, they're heroes and are commended for what they did. But for Peter Norman, things didn't go so well. While Smith and Carlos were kicked out of the Olympic camp, Norman was let off easier in the short term. He was declined a place in the 1972 Olympics and the 2000 Olympics. Smith and Carlos were later respected for their bravery, while Norman was kicked out of his own country for supporting them. In multiple interviews, people asked him whether or not he supported them and agreed with them. In all of the interviews, he said that to stand by them and help them was the right thing to do. Norman said, "I believe that every man is born equal and should be treated that way." The way he stood with his belief his whole life, knowing that if he stood by it, he would have a much harder time, shows both resilience and integrity. He believed that rights should be equal and fair for all people, no matter the difference. Peter Norman died in 2006 at age 64. Smith and Carlos carried his coffin at his funeral. And since he was 26, he has stood by his belief that rights should be equal. Julius Patching, Australia's chief de mission at the time, told Norman, "They're screaming out for your blood, so consider yourself severely reprimanded." In conclusion, Peter Norman showed resilience and integrity when he stood with Smith and Carlos at the 1968 Olympics and continued with his belief throughout his life. Carlos, the man that came third, said Peter Norman deserved to be as well known as Steve Irwin, the crocodile hunter. Thank you for listening. My first source of information is an article by Joe Posnanski called The Forgotten Story of Peter Norman in August 2012. My second source of information is a Wikipedia file about Peter Norman. My third source of information is a video on YouTube about the documentary Salute, written by Peter Norman's son, Matt Norman.